Welcome to the fifth installment of the XenTegra Fortinet session. I'm your host, Chris Dorn, the director of the network practice here at XenTegra. And we have a very special guest today from Fortinet directly. We have Bill Noto. He's the OT segment marketing director. And including him as well are a couple guests. We have Dave Wynegar. He's the lead architect at XenTegra and the CTO One Marksman. And Garrett Brown is joining us. He's the Fortinet technical account manager at Ingram Micro. And Justin Bera, who is the Fortinet sales engineer for the state, local, and education segment here in South Carolina. So welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Really glad to be here, Chris. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, for sure. This blog article I stumbled upon, I'm constantly checking and looking for new stuff, but it really kind of jumped out at me as I'm starting to have a lot more discussions with our customers. But Fortinet was named one of the only two leaders in the 2002 IT/OT Security Platform Navigator report by the Westlands Advisory Group. And this really kind of hopped out at me because there was a nice quadrant chart that was set up and showed the capabilities of Fortinet being able to bridge both the IT and OT segments. And in the recent months, I've really started to see and have conversations with customers as they, some of them are OT enabled or need IoT as a part of their infrastructure. And it seems like they never really kind of came out of the woodwork to talk about it as an OT play in the beginning. So this really kind of struck a chord with me as the opportunity to kind of discuss OT a little bit, how it plays in to organizations, and definitely want to review the article and chat about why Fortinet is this leader, in the way that the fabric works and can bridge both of these segments. So I'll post in the posting here when I get this online. I'll definitely include the link for our listeners to review, but let's start with kind of discussing the article itself a little bit. Bill, Fortinet again named one of the two leaders in this report.
Sure.
And why do you think that? And I know why, but why do you feel like you were placed in such a high category?
Well, that's a great question, Christopher. And we were extremely pleased to be named leader on their report, and we also really appreciated the way Westlands Advisory did their analysis. So, if you look at that quadrant, there are two dimensions. Strategy is the y-axis, and capability positioning is the x-axis. And to have high marks on both strategy and capability is great, right? And so, why is it? Well, for one reason, how do I say this? Our CEO has declared being leaders in OT as a corporate imperative within Fortinet, right? So, Fortinet is a $4 billion organization with 10,000 plus people in the organization. We've been around for 20 years. Our heritage is in firewall, but our main offering these days is called the Security Fabric, which is just a broad suite, a portfolio, a platform of different network security products that all work together in an integrated, automated, and broad way, which means they all work together, right? So that means customers don't have to go and integrate things. We've already integrated them. We also have a broad ecosystem, right? So the strategic emphasis on OT was a key reason why we have high marks. Not the only reason, but it was an important one. And that's borne out, in their analysis. They could see, wow, Fortinet's really doubling down with OT capable teams and experts globally, right? So we've hired OT skilled people, experienced people who understand the constraints of OT everywhere. You can't name a region where you won't find Fortinet OT experts. That's another reason. So, and then I guess our product strategy is we build OT features into the products, right? So we don't have an OT specific product. We have all of our products in the Security Fabric and any of them that are relevant to OT, we put OT stuff in that product. So like a great example of that is the firewall. We have a rugged version of the firewall that sits really well into an OT environment. It can operate, level 1 or 2 of the Purdue model. And then we have OT specific protocol support and intrusion prevention support built in, right? So that means that it's a relevant offering in an OT case. And that is not just in the firewall, but I could say similar things about EDR and SIM, the switch, sandboxing, deception. It goes on and on and on. It's kind of overwhelming how broad the fabric can be sometimes. It can kind of cause cognitive overload. So maybe I'll pause and just ask you, do you feel like you understand how I'm explaining this? Or I don't know, it feels a little
No,
bit like a
definitely.
soliloquy.
No, definitely. I mean, the fabric itself is what is capable of bridging what was air gapped previously and bringing it into a single pane of glass and not having to tackle two different organizations within an organization to handle the IT and the OT side.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so, like one example is in a SOC, right? Like a product you might put in a SOC is a SIEM, a System Information Event Management tool, right? So FortiSIM has capabilities where you can see dashboards that are relevant to OT, like the Purdue model. It also takes obviously data from IT. So it gives you the opportunity to have a synergistic SIM that's ingesting data from both the IT side and the OT side, which is a great benefit for customers too. They don't have to go and train different teams, different people to be handling their SOC analysis and response.
Hey, Bill,
Yeah.
could you speak a little bit about the AI and the capabilities for the automation part of that? I know you mentioned the broad automated, and if you could touch on a little bit more about some of the automation that it does with OT and some of the databases that you have surrounding those things. I know you guys always update your databases and look for new threats out there as well. How does that play into IT OT?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it really varies industry by industry and customer by customer and region by region, how much willingness they are to engage in automation in their OT environment, right? So when we talk about OT automation, from a security perspective, people can get nervous really quickly about like dynamically changing firewall rules, for example, without a human in the loop. So sometimes we hear people use the term automatable, but automation can include everything from something going and like changing a switch, a NAC rule, or a firewall policy, but it could also just be like kicking off a ticket, like, hey, this requires investigation. Someone in ServiceNow, like creating a ServiceNow ticket or a FortiSword ticket to go and actually do some investigation. And then so that I hope that answers your question. From an AI perspective, we have a product called FortiXDR, which is
Okay. No, that's great. I know there's a lot of advancements always going on with your patents, and it'd be nice to know, could you guys talk a little bit about some of the patents that you have and some of the things that you do for innovations at Fortinet? Because I know it's changing all the time, and just like the threats and the threat indexes are changing, you guys seem to be keeping up with it more so than others out there.
I appreciate that observation, David. Definitely Fortinet invests a great deal in innovation, and I think we have like 3 times as many patents as the people we can consider our network security competitors. Yeah, we are very much investing in innovation and in protecting the intellectual property we create. And as to like the updated threat intelligence, our FortiGuard Labs team, has a whole series of different feeds to keep your network security content up to date. And it could be like the botnet feed, or it could be the industrial security service. So with respect to OT specifically, the industrial security service is the feed that helps you basically give you IPS rules specific to OT content. So we have over 500. It's always growing signatures so that we can detect and block vulnerabilities in in the OT environment. And that's available through the ISS, the Industrial Security Service. That's just 2 examples. There are many examples of what they're doing at FortiGuard Labs.
That's great. And Chris, what we're seeing also, and you mentioned, I think, on the last call that it's not just the SCADA networks any longer. It's a lot of, you find an OT everywhere from machine to machine, CNC machinery, utilities, building automation and environmental controls, windmills, solar panels. I mean, there's a lot of different applications out there that people are now integrating into their buildings. And so it's not just for one specific vertical industry. You're seeing it more broad across all industries now.
Yeah, you are. And, great point. The conversations I've had in the past couple weeks, even, it's like, we're looking at this specific model of FortiGate and for our branch sites, and then it rolls into, well, we see that there's a ruggedized edition of that as well. And then we start looking at the services as we're going down the security packages. And it's like, well, here's this industrial controls service that you can subscribe to, and that enables your OT protocols. And then you have the IoT subscription as well, you can place on top of that. And I think it's pretty important to kind of point out, the robustness and capabilities of these firewalls and the generations that are improved upon by Fortinet year after year. They become more capable of sharing and offloading and processing these protocols. I think, like, I've had a question in the past about what kind of overhead are we looking at? If somebody was to look at a FortiGate 60F ruggedized edition, and they were to enable these kind of protocols and services on top of what they're traditionally used for. Is there a lot of overhead that you might see that's applied to the processing on the FortiGates, or is it relatively low?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little bit, just to give you a gauge of my technical knowledge, it's a little bit past my technical depth, so I won't be able to say too much beyond. The devices have special chips that we put in them, right? Like, we create the part of that innovation and IP we talked about earlier is around our ASIC technology, our security chips. So they can process information very quickly. And by all means, we have rigorous QA and testing to make sure that the product can handle. What you wouldn't want to do in a practical use case is turn on them all. You wouldn't turn them all on, right? You'd turn on the ones that are relevant to your environment. So
Sure, that'd be like
we have,
deploying a Windows server and just checking off every role that you possibly could.
it doesn't make
nobody
sense,
would do
right?
that. Yeah,
Exactly. So we have like 1900 OT signatures, which makes the thing broadly applicable. But any given OT environment definitely doesn't have 1900 signatures happening in it, right? So you'd only
Right.
want to use the policy ones that make sense. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, sure. And I was kind of it was a little preloaded too, because the other vendors, they have similar sized firewalls in form factors, but they don't have the additional chipsets inside of them.
Right.
So by knowing that, it's like you're putting that kind of service on a component that we're 100% sure can handle it in the correct fashion if it's deployed properly.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, that's just another key characteristic that differentiates Fortinet from the competition.
Totally agree. So, you were talking earlier about where you find OT, and so I'll just give a little bit of a spiel on that, right? Like, sometimes people get wrapped around the axle or hung up on the nomenclature. So another term people sometimes use is cyber physical systems, which I think is probably a better term that's more generic than OT, which sometimes people use in a very specific way. And sometimes people differentiate between the industrial control system and OT. I don't really do that. I just call it OT. Like, if it's not IT, it's IT-OT convergence at the point where the two networks are talking to each other, and it's OT lower down in the Purdue model, right? But in any case, cyber physical systems would include things like building management systems. Anytime there's, the intersection of things that move and technology.
Very nice.
So is it fair to say, Bill, that a lot of these OT devices were never managed before, and IT traditionally did not have visibility into these devices? They had two departments, and
Yeah.
a lot of these things went uncovered, and therefore, you
Yeah.
could have malicious threats and not even know about it.
Well, yeah, here's how I'd characterize that, David. So traditional OT industrial control system, the controller, the heart or the brain of the thing. So like in an OT environment, you have a controller. The controller sees, thinks, and does on a deterministic fashion, like every 10, 20, or 40 milliseconds. It's taking information from sensors, it's doing some logic, and then it's sending a signal to actuate something like open that breaker or turn on that pump or close that valve, right? That's the nature of cyber physical. That's the nature of what's happening in the OT world. That's what the PLC does. Traditional PLCs, they were not designed with security in mind. So rather than zero trust, they're designed with like 100% trust. They do what they're told. If you can send them a signal in formatted correctly on the protocol that they expect, they believe it. They believe it's legit. Most controllers that are in industry, and these things get deployed for like 30-year lifespans. Now, the reason is historically those networks were deployed separate from IT networks, right?
As a closed network, you're saying, right?
Yeah, sometimes people use the term air gap, right? They just
Air gap. Yep.
originally were not designed to be connected to the rest of the enterprise or at the company that owned the stuff, or certainly not to the internet, right? So, on those networks, you had controllers and field devices and SCADA systems and historians. Historically, that stuff was air gapped. Now these things are being connected for a variety of reasons, but typically it's because asset owners are trying to get more value out of their investment. They want to know when things are going to break before they break. They want to anticipate things breaking using, analytics and digital twins and understanding what's happening on the machine. So like historically, you might have a technician who knows when it sounds funny because it's vibrating weirdly that there's a problem. Well, now they want to be able to detect that it's vibrating weirdly and know that something's off
Before it
using
breaks.
analytics, right? But
Yeah.
so in addition to that, they want to move from calendar-based maintenance, like I'm going to turn a wrench on that bolt every 6 months, to condition-based maintenance. So rather than going from a schedule to I have to, turn this thing off and climb up this wind turbine every 6 months to I have to do it when the bolts are loose, right? Like that's condition-based maintenance over schedule-based maintenance. These are the reasons why industrial assets are being connected, why just some of the reasons why these industrial assets are being connected. And that's what's driving connectivity to those OT environments, which historically didn't have a lot of security in them. And so you got to do something to enable security while you're doing that. And to your question of historically, have they been managed separately? Definitely. Definitely. Historically, IT teams were responsible for, protecting the privacy of the employees, for enabling email and file sharing and, the core load on the company laptop and troubleshooting issues people were having in the enterprise, right? Historic IT organizations have not been responsible for the process, the industrial process that might be associated with the enterprise. That's changing now. We see more CIOs and CISOs taking on responsibility for ensuring the network security of these things. That's part of convergence. When people talk about IT/OT convergence, it's really two aspects to it. There's the networks talking to each other side. So that formerly isolated air gap being connected to the IT network or to the cloud, that's a kind of convergence. But another kind is organizational convergence, where people are taking on different responsibilities and roles.
So,
Yeah.
so
That's
Bill,
great. Great summary. Yeah. Thank you.
I just want to follow up on that, just because this is kind of going into that. I think I'm going to lead into this, but are there some like good best practices that you can kind of think of, or for some, like, let's say a smaller machine shop, they have basic internet practices, something like that, and they have that IT OT mix. Are you kind of leaning towards you have to have the more of a segmentation within that network? You got to start prioritizing. You have to do an analysis. Is there like kind of a good jumping point here for people to kind of do that? Is that kind of like the CTAP or the cyber threat assessment to kind of see where those gaps are? Or is there an easy way, in the FortiOS or in the Fortinet umbrella to kind of see that? If someone's
Yeah,
making that change.
those are some great ideas. So there are a couple things that come to mind. first of all, from an organizational perspective, get curious, right? Like a lot of times IT and OT organizations have different cultures, don't necessarily understand one another. IT team, like a typical example, like sort of the canonical example is the IT team comes into the OT environment and they're surprised to see like legacy versions of Windows in the environment. Like, what? We still have Windows XP? You sure do. In your OT environment, it's quite common actually. And it's not no longer supported by Windows, but the software that runs the process that makes the company's product, that is what the company makes money by selling, is oftentimes based on that stuff, and they don't have a way around it for some reason, right? So like from a best practice perspective, I would say, politely say, I noticed you haven't been able to patch that. Can you tell me why? Rather than like, what's wrong with you? Why haven't you patched that?
Yeah.
Right? Like, so oftentimes these organizations can alienate one another just by not being curious. So I think curiosity begets empathy, begets collective problem solving. That's one thing. From a technology perspective, though, what I would say the first thing is segmentation, right? Like the OT environment should be properly segmented from the IT environment. And so you can still do your digital transformation thing where data can flow from the OT side up to the cloud or the enterprise data center or whatever. But you want it to be properly segmented so you're managing the data, you're managing who has access, you're managing who can get into it and touch it and see it. And that's, a tremendous use case for firewalls, basically. The very first thing we would recommend from a best practice perspective is segmentation. But there are lots of other things too. Endpoint protection is great, especially in the higher levels of the IT OT convergence area of the Purdue model. So if you think about like, I told you about that PLC earlier, right? That PLC sits down at like level 2 of the model, right? The PLC is the thing that's the programmable logic controller. It's very unlikely that someone's going to write ransomware that gets on your PLC. That's just not a thing that we've seen much of. There've only been like 7 or 8 actual PLC specific attacks. Most of them are most of the issues that cause problems in OT environments are like the classic IT issues that leak into OT environments. So the way that PLC gets its instructions is usually through an engineering workstation, some kind of Windows computer that has software from the PLC vendor where an engineer writes the instructions like, hey, when you see that thing vibrating beyond a certain tolerance, turn off. Or like another example is like, if the wind's blowing, turn on the wind turbine, right? That kind of logic is in the programmable logic controller. But the logic gets to the programmable logic controller through an engineering workstation, which is a Windows computer. And that Windows computer is a great place to consider putting endpoint protection. Other things in that environment are like historians, which are basically special databases for time series data. So rather than like a SQL relational database, a historian is like really good at ingesting high speed data that's just like a timestamp and a tag. Like at 11:03:03, the temperature was 70 degrees. That's an example. Those historian databases also typically run on Windows. That's a great place for an endpoint protection offering. And then you have jump boxes often used to access these environments. So also a great place.
Yeah.
The historians, the jump boxes, the engineering workstations are really ripe places to protect your OT environment because that's how people get into it, right? Like you, that's sort of the point of ingress.
See,
Yeah.
do you see in that playing off of that, do you see like in the industry in these controllers as they're being updated and maybe refreshed inside a manufacturing organization? Are we starting to see more things required to connect to like a cloud service
Oh yeah.
versus like, so that just immediately points out like that on-prem infrastructure isn't necessarily needed or it is supported in this
Right.
kind of refresh cycle. So you have to connect to their cloud service.
Right.
We have to protect it.
Definitely that's a trend. And it's also I would say it's not like an overnight trend. So someone yesterday asked me the question like, if Elon Musk is building a new battery factory, do you think he's going to put in like a dumb you know, a dumb piece of equipment or a smart piece of equipment. Like everyone these days is buying smart everything, right? And if you're Elon Musk, you're probably buying smart equipment in your factory, I would guess. And so it kind
And
of
by
begs the question. It
smart,
kind of,
yeah, it's connected everywhere.
yeah, and it makes a case for more zero trust thinking in an OT environment too, right? Like there are going to be all these additional edges and points of, you know, intersection with that. So how do you protect it? I think the architecture you need for that kind of scenario is zero trust. But it's it's not something that happens overnight. Lots of organizations are loath to do it, and so I don't know. We are seeing more PLCs like auto update, auto patch themselves, and in some cases that breaks the process. So that's like a case where a PLC vendor is trying to be, you know, as forward leaning as they can from a security perspective, but the asset owner, their customer, can be frustrated if it like doesn't work right, and causes an interruption to production.
I definitely bet you can see that all the time. It's like, you know, you refresh two pieces of machinery sitting next to the newer or the older version of that same model to perform that same function, but it's running two different kind of code bases. One's
Right.
30 years old on that older deployment, and you got the newer updated one, and the newer one's updating left and right on its own.
Right.
That could be a problem.
Yeah. Another thing to bear in mind is, you know, one way OT is different than IT is typically equipment gets refreshed every 5 years in an IT environment. Most OT environments get deployed for 30-year planned deployment. That's why you see those old Windows XP systems. It's just there wasn't a budget to update them is one reason. Or you know, the software running on it is no longer supported, but we're still using it to make this stuff. That's another reason.
Right.
Yeah, you'll see sometimes also, I noticed that Microsoft has them called long-term licensing, so that they'll support a product, 10 years versus 5 years on some of their OSs in just an industrial environment.
Yeah, totally. It's not uncommon. And the real OT focused hardware companies often have longer, you know, support windows and lifetimes on their products because that's what the buying center requires.
Yeah, embedded technologies also, right? You see a lot of embedded technologies and hardened type processors that go into these devices as they get purchased and put in for some industrial type solutions.
Right. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if you just think about like the installed base of all the manufacturing and like OT capacity on the planet right now, that's a lot of OT stuff, most of which doesn't have good security built into it, and a lot of which is being connected so that people can do something to get, you know, a better outcome. Know that something's going to break before it breaks. Better staff, better understand how their staff are doing maintenance or whatever. And all of it requires, you know, thought and care and remediation. This was
Isn't that the interesting thing that where it goes though is because I kind of think back further and I think back into the development. Who are the guys sitting, writing this code that are building the operating systems that run these controllers, right? I was working with a ceramics manufacturer that makes some of the ceramics that go into the U.S. military tanks, and they had an Ethernet port in their controllers, but they had never connected them. And so the customer came and said, "Hey, we want to plug this in, and we want to get access to these so we can monitor some things, bring our OT environment into IT." And so we plugged in, and within about 3 minutes, it shut down every kiln in the place. And the kilns were, the kilns are like 40 feet by 40 feet. They're massive. And if they cool down below a certain threshold, then they take about 3 days to warm back up and stabilize before they can pass ceramics through them again. And so it turns out that what had happened was that the IP protocol that was built into these controllers was very poorly written. Whoever wrote it didn't follow the standards. They thought it was good enough, it handled what they needed, and they moved on. And so I think there's a dimension of that as well where it can be exploited, where malicious actors can come and exploit poorly written code, even in normal protocol stacks that you think should be standardized and normalized. And so I think that's another dimension of OT that we run into is that the developers that are writing the stuff, they're kind of that, they seem to me a lot of it is kind of quick and dirty. Let's get it in, write the code, make it work. Does it do what we want? Yes. Have we thought of anything else about that? Not really. Move on.
And what were the assumptions when they wrote it, right? Like they wrote it assuming that would be an air-gapped environment and that no one would ever want to connect anything to it. And so it did what it needed to do. And it was the problem is now those assumptions are changing because that asset owner of that kiln wants to get data out of it. So they need some way to essentially isolate the network and be able to interact with it. And a lot of these environments are created for, a lot of these environments are deployed for long periods of time, right? So like that was probably written a long time ago and deployed a long time ago. And yeah, that's it. That's an interesting story,
Yeah.
Justin.
Yeah, those kilns have been online for 20 years and running. And finally somebody said, let's plug into them.
I think I said everything I was hoping to say. I hope it's going to be a good podcast source
Oh, it's
material for
awesome.
you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's I presented like OT as something we should tackle as an organization here at XenTegra about a year ago, and it took a little while for folks to say or even understand really what OT stood for.
Sure.
And now, and it's kind of like, well, it's there. It's just probably a different group of people inside of your customers' organizations that we need to talk to.
Totally.
And we don't want to beat it to death, but at the same time, it's like we want the best for our customers. We want everybody to be protected. Like we're pointing out here, these protocols were not designed to do anything but one function with little to no security ever in mind when they were developed. So it's really on us as the partner to preach this over and over again until folks kind of are aware of it, at least to the point where they could take some kind of action, and that they know that somebody like XenTegra is there to help them with it.
Right
Yeah,
on.
I think what Garrett mentioned also earlier, using a CTAP and having that capability. I mean, XenTegra, we can go out and have a small engagement, go into a customer, help them identify and really see where they are from a security posture by placing one of those devices in there, and then working like Bill had mentioned with the engineering teams, both on both sides, provide that consulting services to help bridge the gap between the IT and the OT using the Fortinet products and our experience working in the industries, both ends, and try to, like you said, be curious about it and promote that curiosity to really define what it is the business requires, and then map those business requirements just like you would in IT, but now in OT, and make sure that the mediator or the gateway device can interpret both sides of the communication. So having that FortiGate sometimes just as a bridge between the IT and OT can act as that type of gateway, so everybody has visibility and communication and even a connection as an edge to a cloud service to report on gathering of data lake information and present it into a dashboard using Grafana or anything really. It really does make a lot of visibility into organizations for very little cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sure does. Well, good point, Dave.
So we'll be
really
coming back maybe next time, a follow up. We'll have a plan to go out with a couple engagements where we can show some of the best practices that we're deploying and some of the methodologies we're using in different verticals.
That'll be interesting. Yeah, I'll look forward to that. And I think the CTAP, I'm sorry I didn't talk about it much, but it is a great opportunity. And there's actually an OT specific CTAP report that's in the process of being rolled out right now. I'm not sure if you guys have seen that yet. It's XenTegra or Ingram Micro, but it's in the works. No. It's in the works, and ask whoever your channel manager is, hey, how can I try this? Because they're looking for people to try it. It's a first iteration, but it actually is capable and could be useful for building pipeline and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, just the regular reports, they open up so much conversation after people see those reports roll out that I'm actually very intrigued to see what the OT side of excuse me, the OT side of things looks like.
Right on.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, take care, guys.
Very good. Yeah, well, thank you, Bill, for being here. Dave, Garrett, and Justin. It was a wonderful conversation. Hopefully our listeners get something really beneficial out of this. And we'll talk to you guys soon.
Looking forward to hearing the podcast. Perfect. Thanks for the opportunity to be on your show. It's really fun.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Take care,
Talk
guys.
to you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.